Winston Churchill wrote a very entertaining book called History of English-Speaking Peoples, plural. And in the very beginning of the first volume, it's a 4-volume work, he talks about life in Britain between, say, 100 AD and 400 AD. And he says that life in Britain was never as good as it was then. That even wealthy people didn't have as good a life till the end of Victorian times, or maybe later. What are we talking about? What did he mean? He meant that indeed throughout a huge area of Europe, Asia, and Africa, there was an established system which provided many things which we attribute to civilization now. For example, most wealthy people in England, and maybe even not so wealthy, and by the way, England was a far, far away place. It was not at all the center. But these people had central heating, something which no king of England would get till 19th century. They had hot baths, hot water running in their houses. They could wash and did wash every day. There were wonderful bathing facilities available to everyone. For example, baths in Bath. There is a place in the west of England called Bath. They still survive, and pretty amazing. We do not have public baths as wonderful as what Romans provided. There were roads which are still used. There was a road system which was growing till maybe the middle of the 4th century. After that it was repaired, but not for long, which were sort of as sophisticated in some sense as any modern highway system. Clearly better quality. Very few contemporary highways are going to be usable after 2,000 years. There were water supply system, which was unbelievably advanced. The water was clean, easily available. There was sanitation. Cloaca Magna in Rome was a marvel. This was a system which was taking all the excrements out of the city. Well, maybe into a river. They didn't quite realize that it's not a good thing to do. But nevertheless, it was far more advanced than anything, say, London have in the early 19th century. So there was this enormous area from as far as Euphrates and in the east, and as far as Adrian Wall, and only crazy Scots were beyond that, wild Picts, as they were then called, was quite civilized. You could write a letter, and people did, and send it, and it would arrive in any part of this civilized space. You could basically write a check and send money, as we do now. In many respects, even today, this area is not as civilized and connected as it was then. I could travel through Libya then without any problems. I wouldn't dare do it now. Right? So we're talking about this great civilizing influence of Roman Empire. And it's impossible to talk about Western civilization without talking about Rome. Again, what was the greatest contribution of Romans? Of course, they did have literature, splendid literature, second only to one other literature. Sadly enough, there were Greeks before them, but it was a great literature. And if I could extend my series of lectures, I would, of course, talk about great poets such as Virgil and Ovid. I would talk about their great playwrights. I would talk about their historians. I actually will talk about their historians somewhat during this lecture and the next lecture. But it wasn't their intellectual accomplishments for which Romans are remembered. Romans are remembered because they created this thing called the empire. This is, in many respects, their greatest legacy. Again, there are empires in other parts of the world. Actually, the only comparable empire would be Chinese empire, Empire of the Han. But in terms of its stability. But they created an empire which lasted for arguably 2,000 years. The Rome started, at least the official starting date of Rome, which people used to memorize and everybody used to know, was 753 BC. It's an important date because that's when Romulus, the founder of Rome, started it. Of course, modern historians say, well, there was no Romulus, and of course they say that Rome wasn't founded in 753. Well, whatever they say, maybe it was indeed founded later, somewhere around 650. Maybe it was founded by Etruscan kings, and official history actually does recognize that eventually Etruscan kings rule Rome. And they rule it for a long time. The second important date is the year 509 BC, another date which people used to know. That is the beginning of Roman Republic. Kings are chased away. And indeed, at that point, Rome starts growing. If you look at any historical map, at that time, Rome is a tiny settlement. But gradually, it expands, and say by the year 300, it occupies large chunk of central Italy, still a regional power. I don't think that Greeks were taking it seriously. Don't forget that in the year 322, Greeks had an enormous empire. Alexander the Great conquered the world. He didn't pay any attention to those Italians, but he conquered the really major empire, the Persian Empire. He conquered Egypt. He went as far as India, that is Punjab, and Greek civilization used to think of itself as the civilized world. We talked about it. Being civilized meant speaking Greek. Nobody paid any attention to this little Italian state, which was, of course, growing and growing and growing. Eventually, while Greeks were fighting amongst each other, because successors of Alexander decided to split the world into three big parts. Simple way of thinking about it: Egyptians, or Egyptian kingdom of Ptolemies, Syrians, Seleucids, and Macedonians. These are three successors of Alexander, which keep fighting each other, because what else would you do? I mean, they were Greeks, they remembered the historical memory. You fight other Greeks. And while they were fighting each other, there is little barbarian kingdom of course they were viewing Romans as barbarians, were growing and growing. In the middle of the 3rd century, this, republic, this empire, growing empire, still sort of military thing, had to fight another barbarian empire, Carthage. Of a great history of the 3rd century in the West is, of course, 3 wars which Rome fought against Carthage. The most exciting, of course, is the 2nd war, because during that war, the greatest Carthaginian general, Hannibal, brought his elephants into Italy, and for about 15 years wandered around up and down peninsula, defeating all Roman armies, but without much success, meaning Romans would not give up. They would suffer terrible losses, but they would not give up. Eventually, Carthage recalled the victorious general and eventually sort of gave up the fight. Sort of Romans, whatever they had stamina. They would fight and fight and fight and eventually win against just about every opponent. So by the end of the 3rd century, they control Italy, Sicily, Sardinia, Corsica, and part of Spain. That's not bad. But then they said, oh, why don't we move to the east? Because there are these Greek things. And about 50 years later, they control Greece and Macedonia. They defeat Macedonians, so they keep conquering and conquering and conquering. And then by the middle of the 1st century, they conquer, 1st century BC, they conquer Gaul, which means France. They conquer Palestine. They conquer Egypt. They basically rule the world. There are some other things they would conquer. It will take them another 150 years to conquer Romanians. They were tough. Romanians were, well, they were not Romanians. Yes. They sort of eventually populated Romania with their own people. Romanians are actually probably direct descendants of Roman settlers. At least their language clearly is. So they gradually expand their empire. So gradually they create this world where you could indeed travel. There are no more pirates. It's again, the next point in time where there are no pirates in the Mediterranean is 20th century. It takes a long time to replicate what they had. So Mediterranean became safe. The roads became safe. You actually could travel from place to place without being robbed, which were not necessarily the case during the Greek times. By the way, Greek roads were atrocious. We still have them. I'm not criticizing modern Greece at all. What I'm referring to is the simple fact that inside Greece, nobody would think of creating a highway from Athens to Sparta, because that's an extremely dangerous thing to do. From at least Athenian point of view, but from Spartan point of view as well. So there would be occasional roads inside a city-state, but no interstate highways. That is a Roman invention. So Greek roads were not sophisticated. Greek infrastructure system was not sophisticated. They had certain aspects of civilization, but what we mean modern civilization comes with Rome. Of course it was, and this is a complicated thing for us to sort of think about it. Rome creates, as civilized world as we would know for 2,000 years. And maybe even now we do not have that. But it was a cruel world. Every time they would conquer some part of the world, what would they do? They would bring hundreds of thousands of slaves. Greek slaves? Greek slaves did very well, by the way. If you wanted to be a slave in Rome, being a Greek, especially educated Greek, was a good thing, because the price for a Greek slave was very high. All the rich Romans would want to have Greek slaves educate their children, right? It was good. I mean, if you were a Dacian slave, that's another story, right? Or later on, when Pompey conquers Palestine, he brings a bunch of Jewish slaves. These are useless. I mean, actually, Romans didn't want them. They let most of them be free very shortly because they didn't speak Greek and they were not very good. So very quickly appears to be a settlement of freedmen Jews in Rome as these slaves were liberated. Romans were quite liberal in terms of most families would let many of the slaves go free after a relatively short period of time. It was a customary thing to do. Of course, if you worked in the mines, that was another story. But again, it was a cruel empire. They would conquer all kinds of people. So here comes this amazing thing which we still haven't solved. Are empires good? Do they really provide good for people? Yes, they are. Here we have to understand that with all its cruelty, after the empire collapses in 476 in the West, much worse times come. Any Roman slave would hope to be a Roman slave, not a free person under the barbarian occupation. It's a strange thing, but it was terrible. For hundreds of years, the dream of the empire was alive. The empire, of course, survives in the East for a long time. 1453 is the end of the empire in the East. But it was good, in a sense. With all the cruelty, with all the terrible things, the civilization that empire provided was something people pined for centuries after that. They provided education. They provided medical care. They provided entertainment, even for the poor. Observe that Roman Empire was as good as American Empire in terms of mass entertainment. It was as cruel and brutal as it is now. We're not talking about Greeks, we're talking about horror shows. I mean, gladiatorial games were indeed the main entertainment of the Romans. And it was as bloody as what you see on television or whatever you watch. It was, of course, more realistic. And people were terribly addicted, as they are, to television and the movies right now. I mean, we know that even at the end of 4th century, when the empire is Christian, or at least quote Christian, quote, gladiatorial games are going on, and Saint Augustine tells about his close friend who became so addicted to games he couldn't literally live a week without attending the games and seeing somebody being slaughtered. Blood attracts people. Again, this is why we have Hollywood. So there was, of course, lots of sex too. So they were providing, whatever archaeological evidence we have is that there were sex shops. They were far ahead, of course, of United States. They were on par with Europe. So, which is far ahead, far ahead of the United States. We really live in a backward part of the world. I'm not aware of a single sex shop in Palo Alto. Just think about it. There is one now. Okay, comes from an expert. Okay, there is one. So, okay, there is one now, but only one. So, again, with all these things, with gladiatorial games, with sex and other of all kinds, as we shall see just a little later, it was a fundamentally good thing. What came after was really dark. So the collapse of the empire was a tragedy which cannot be imagined. Right? Gradually, roads become unsafe. Goths destroy the water system. They really, in order to conquer the city of Rome, they break the aqueducts. And the population declines probably by a factor of 20. If there is no water, people cannot live. There is absolutely no say by the end of the 6th century, Roman civilization in the West is destroyed. It still, again, remember, it still survives in the East. We have this amazing remnant of Roman Empire surviving for hundreds and hundreds of years. It would have survived, except first it was betrayed by European West. There was a terrible thing which people used to know called the Fourth Crusade, which no Greek will ever forget. This is why when they talk about now, should they fund Greece? I say, of course. After what you did, in 1204, yes, you should fund Greece. It was a terrible cataclysmic event when Western Christians conquer Constantinople, loot the treasures, bring literally prostitutes into Hagia Sophia, the central church of Eastern Christendom. Horrendous thing. Again, the memory of that still remains, and it was indeed a terrible event. Greeks, however, reestablished the Eastern Empire, but then only for a short time. Nobody helps them. In 1453, the remnant of the Romans, the last standing Romans, disappear after Constantinople is sacked. By that time, of course, the good thing, if there could be a good thing about things like that, the West is ready to grab the torch. So the scholars from Constantinople move to Italy and educate Western barbarians, and Renaissance start. That's the simple story of Western civilization, if you like. Now, what should you know about Rome? My advice, and here you remember I did not include any Roman books in the short canon. But of course, short canon is just a short canon. We could extend it occasionally. There is a book which I would strongly recommend that you read because it's an easy book. Even the least educated and least intellectually inclined person should have no difficulty reading it. It's a wonderful book by Suetonius called The Lives of 12 Caesars. There is a remarkable translation of it by Robert Graves. And if you are totally incapable of reading, watch a television show based on Robert Graves' book, different book, not the translation, on his book, I, Claudius. There was a wonderful BBC show called I, Claudius with Derek Jacobi playing Claudius. So that's the sort of, for people who couldn't read, at least you could watch that. It is actually, if there are some good things on television, that's one of them. It is, I also believe, available on Prime here. So, okay. So why do I want to recommend Suetonius? Is he the deepest of historians? No, probably the deepest of Roman historians would be Tacitus, Cornelius Tacitus. We'll be talking about him a little bit during the next lecture. Is he the most philosophical of Romans? No. Seneca, of course, would be the most philosophical. Great philosopher and playwright and the teacher of Nero. Whether it qualifies him as anything, but I mean, he ended up actually sort of being killed by Nero, so I guess you pay for what you do. He didn't educate Nero well enough, apparently. No, I do not recommend. By the way, I do love Seneca, and those of you who want to read a little bit of Roman philosophy, his Letters of a Stoic, or Letters to Lucilius, probably the best introduction to both Stoic philosophy and Roman philosophy. A wonderful, wonderful book. But it's not what I do recommend. Again, I love Ovid, and Ovid's Metamorphoses is probably the best introduction to Greek mythology, written by Roman, but nevertheless a beautiful one. But I nevertheless, if you are to read only one book written by a Roman, I would recommend Suetonius. And somebody would say, look, Alex, you are mad, which is of course true, but there is a method in my madness. There is something in Suetonius which is totally lacking in Greek writers, and which is totally lacking in anything we find now. Here is a Roman historian writing in the middle of 2nd century about first 12 Roman Caesars. The amazing thing is that he has not one good word to say about them. So this is the book, in some sense, this is the book which made me into a dissident when I was, 12 years old, and I read it. I said, oh, now I see how all these guys are. That is, this is an amazing book which shows how you could have a great empire, something for which people would be crying for centuries, ruled by a bunch of utterly crazy nuts, even the best of them. And he's merciless. You know, obviously, like Augustus was viewed with great reverence by Romans. They named a month after him. He indeed started this period of peace and prosperity, a remarkable thing. 30 BC is this great date when, the peace of, universal peace, the Roman peace, becomes available. Yes? Well, you read Suetonius, you will see not everything is so peachy with Augustus. And of course, after that comes people like Tiberius, compared with whom Augustus is, of course, a saint. And then comes Caligula, compared with whom just about anyone is a saint. Things he did, we cannot imagine. Are they all true? Again, you could get this idea that, all the rich and powerful people are, subhuman. It's true, but probably not to the degree Suetonius makes them be. But it's an important book precisely because it gives you a certain, if you like, vaccination against, adoring the rich and powerful. So, and again, this is a book which has been read from Roman times. It's sort of, while nobody reads Tacitus, everybody, by the way, this is, in terms of raciness, why did I read it when I was 12? Well, if you read it now, you will understand. No boy when he's 12 or 13 could resist this book. It used to be that, at least in Europe, that families which had large libraries would arrange the books in the following order. The certain books would be on the very top shelves. So this was always on a very top shelf. And of course, every child knew very well that you shouldn't read anything on the bottom shelves. You should just get a stool, get to the top shelf, and read really cool stuff. So it's a racy book. But it's a great book, again, because it allowed for ages people to sort of realize that maybe the power is not everything which you should adore. So again, 12 Caesars by Suetonius. The Penguin edition is very good because it's translation by Robert Graves. If you want a nice edition, also translated by Graves, look by Folio Society edition. You could find it used on Amazon for about $20. So it's a little bit more expensive than Penguin, but highly recommend. I don't get any commission. Well, which is not true, actually. I get commission from Amazon twice a month. Okay. Now we have to sort of let us look at this wonderful thing and think, what are the consequences for us? Time and time again, after the fall of the empire in the West, people would attempt to rebuild it, to build another empires. Right? Of course, the first great attempt, and indeed a great attempt, no question about it, was an attempt by Charlemagne, who at the end of the 8th, beginning of 9th century, no, I'm century. Am I century off? No, I think I'm correct. Sort of builds a large European empire and eventually is crowned as an emperor by the Pope, and even recognized as such with sort of some disdain by the Eastern emperors, because after all, he's a barbarian. But nevertheless, they accept his empire. And again, one of the founding myths of modern Europe is this empire of Charlemagne. Sort of every time people talk about united Europe, the thought of Charlemagne comes to mind. Again, he attempts to rebuild culture. He brings the great scholars all the way from Britain and Ireland. There are no scholars left in Europe, so he brings people like Alcuin to his court who attempt to do some educational thing. Of course, he himself does not know how to read. By that time, even emperors do not know how to read. The people who do tend to be monks, sort of literacy among non-monks is basically at zero. But again, he tries to restore literacy, bring scholars. Again, it doesn't survive for long. The empire crumbles. But these attempts of rebuilding empire last and last and last. Think about it. Every time somebody talks about Tsar, you heard the term. What is Tsar? Where does the word come? Well, it's the abbreviation of Caesar. Right? So these, after the collapse of the Constantinople, there is a question, who is the successor? And indeed, there is one heir of the Palaeologs, the last ruling dynasty, Sophia Zoar Palaeolog, who is a ward of the Pope. And the Pope arranges a marriage between her and Ivan III. It's not Ivan the Terrible. Ivan the Terrible is Ivan IV. Ivan III of Russia, which immediately gives Russian Grand Dukes the idea that now they are successors to the Byzantium. And indeed, they eventually, since they have this connection to Palaeologs, they accept the title, or they become czars with Ivan IV, the Terrible. So they are successors. They view themselves as the successors of Roman Caesars. Actually, in Russia, they come with this amazing theory of Moscow as the third Rome. The first Rome fell because they became heretics, Latins, Catholics. Then the second Rome fell again. They have a clear explanation because they became heretics. They sort of declared union with Latins at the Council of Florence. And they fell there under Turks. And the third Rome is Moscow, and the third Rome will stay forever. So this is a great imperial ambition of the Russian czars. Right? And of course, the dream of Russian czars from that point till the First World War is the conquest of Constantinople. Sort of across on Hagia Sophia, the main church, is the dream of Russian czars and later emperors. And maybe sadly it never happens. By the way, if there was no Russian Revolution, it would have happened because both England and France conceded Constantinople to Russia. So if Russia stayed in the war till 1918, there would be a cross on Hagia Sophia. Just, 100 years ago, it was still possible. But they were not the only imperial nation. Of course, there was Austro-Hungarian Empire, which viewed itself as a successor of Roman Empire till the beginning of 19th century. Only then they sort of changed the imperial outlook. Then, of course, and it's very simple. How do you know if an empire claims descendant from Rome? You have to look at the main symbol of how did you know that Romans came to town? What did you see? Eagles. You saw eagles. So when you see eagles, you know that a country wants to be a successor to Rome. Next time you watch Obama, observe. There is an eagle. And of course, United States, whether it is admitted or realized, views itself as a successor. Of course, the founding fathers viewed themselves as successors to Romans. Of course, for them, restoring the republic They were not restoring some republic, they were restoring the Roman Republic. When they were starting a parliament, they didn't call it a parliament, they used the word Senate. Where does it come from? Roman Senate. Right? So the empires, the dream of empire is still the central dream of the Western civilization. When they talk about United Europe, especially when you go back to the 50s when people started talking about United Europe, of course they were thinking of Rome, of course they were thinking about Charlemagne's empire. Again, we have to remember, empire is not a bad thing. It's not necessarily a bad thing. It's not totally a bad thing. Right? Yes, every empire tends to outreach and conquer more than it could rule. Yes, every empire tend not to notice, again, we all, like Romans, did not pay any sort of heed to these minor things. Oh, there are all these Jews which were just enslaved. Of course, I mean, what else would you do with them? They're not civilized. They were not. They're barely human, and they don't want to eat pork. So we'll be talking about Jews in the next lecture to greater detail. So no Roman actually would criticize his country for that. That was a normal thing to do. There was a manifest destiny. God was on their side. That is a necessary thing. You cannot create an empire unless you believe that gods are on your side. You cannot go and say, let's take California from Mexico, or Gaul from the French, unless you believe that there is some fundamental right to take other people's stuff and rule it. But again, we shouldn't criticize this thing too much, because the alternative to imperial rule is often barbarian chaos. So this is the sad fact which we need to remember. Again, I always want to criticize empires. After all, I did read Suetonius in my youth and many times after. But on the other hand, empires provide us with roads, they provide us with stable currency, they provide us with good educational system. So it's a very, very hard thing. We have to remember this duality of imperial vision. Yes, it's something which provides us with good, but yes, it often comes at the cost of terrible injustice and misery of millions. Okay, that's the end of the lecture.